This episode of the Sustainability Scope was brought to you by AM Custom Clothing. If you need sustainable custom branded clothing for your business, band or brand, head to amcustomclothing.co.uk today.
Welcome to the Sustainability Scope with me, Alex.
And me, Mike.
The show that cuts through the noise about sustainability to help you make informed decisions, whether you're an individual or a business.
So, Alex, this week we're going to talk about organic, which is, I think, probably going to be the biggest and perhaps most complicated topic that we've tackled so far. And I fear that we may not come to a decisive conclusion by the end of this episode.
No, it's as we found in looking into this, it's actually a far more complex subject than kind of it appears on the surface. And although we've dealt with organic in our own sectors, like as soon as you look beyond that, it's just that there's so much more to it that even we weren't aware of.
Definitely. So the reason why organic is a topic that we need to tackle is because so many of us are buying organic products, either intentionally going out of our way to pick the products off the shelves that contain an organic label, or just coincidentally, accidentally picking them up because they're just what's there. If we look at just the food part of the organic market, organic food is currently growing at around 14% per year. Just between 2022 and 2023, I assume these statistics are sort of partway through a year, because we haven't quite finished 2023 yet. But between 2022 and 2023, globally, we spent $249 billion on organic foods, which is up $45 billion from last year. And if we look at clothing, where we know more about in terms of organic stuff, that is currently growing at a compounded annual growth rate of 40% between 2021 and 2028 is the forecast. 40% growth. That's huge. So I guess the first place we need to start is actually defining what organic is, because it depends on who you ask, I think, is the summary of it, isn't it? So if we take a really, really simple dictionary definition, organic means, according to the Cambridge Dictionary at least, not using artificial chemicals in the growing of plants and animals for food and other products. So basically, not using artificial stuff in your farming.
Yeah. Versus some of the bodies that certify organic, like the Soil Association, have much more thorough, I guess, definitions.
Complex, maybe convoluted, even one might argue.
where they have kind of a set of principles that form part of that definition.
Yeah, but they go way beyond just that basic chemical definition.
It becomes more than just. I often think about, let's say, organic is about the environment and not, I guess, damaging it, whereas it has that element to it, but then it's also concerned for the well-being of people, which goes somewhat into ethics as opposed to just the environment. So it does have a bit of, I guess, a crossover there that you wouldn't necessarily expect, or at least with the Soil Association. With other certification bodies, I guess it differs. But should we talk a little bit about the principles that are?
Yeah, they have four, don't they?
Yeah, so we've got the principle of health. So organic agriculture, it should sustain and enhance the health of the soil, plant, animal, and human. So it shouldn't take from it. It should be there to improve it, or at least keep it sustained. We've got the principle of ecology. So that's organic agriculture should be based on living ecological systems and cycles and work with them to emulate them and help sustain them. So not against them. We've got the principle of fairness, which is where it kind of crosses path a little bit, I think, with ethics and
Mm.
everything else, where it's a case of organic agriculture should build on the relationships that ensures fairness with regard to the common environment and life opportunities. Then the last point that Soil Association in particular have is the principle of care, and that's organic agriculture should be managed in a precautionary and responsible manner to protect the health and well-being of current and future generations and the environment. So that's a lot more complex than
That's
just
a lot more complex, and I would argue I would struggle to nail down what that actually means,
yeah, and how you
or at
measure it.
least how I would interpret that is going to be different to how you might interpret that, or someone off the street would interpret that. And I think this is perhaps emblematic of the problems or confusions that we're going to end up talking about shortly.
Yes. That said, I do think it's good in some respects that it has such wide coverage, because it makes it just a little bit more than just that
Yeah, it means
artificial
it's not a
chemicals, doesn't
one-trick
it?
pony. It
Yeah.
means that it's a little bit more it's going to add to the wider benefit, but I think it may be that the organic movement needs to go in that direction to try and sustain itself, perhaps. I don't know. um let's look into it a little bit more, and kind of let's see how it goes. So one of the biggest arguments in the organic space, and possibly is what's driving much of the growth of the organic products market, is the benefits of organic. Um, these benefits will differ from depending on who you ask. They will often grow over time, and they're very, very broad. They cover everything from um, individual benefits to you as the person buying and consuming organic products, all the way to the planet as a whole. So we've got a list here that we've picked from the internet, and I'm just going to list every single one of them, and then we can go back through them. So we've got number 1, reduced exposure to pesticides and harmful chemicals. Number 2, better taste. Number 3, support for sustainable farming practices. Number 4, improved soil health and biodiversity. Number 5, lower carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. Number 6, water conservation and reduced pollution. Number 7, enhanced animal welfare standards. Number 8, non-GMO ingredients. Number 9, preserving natural ecosystems and wildlife habitats. And number 10, contributing to a greener and healthier planet. Some of them are very, very vague. Some of them are very, very subjective. And some of them are less those two things. The two that really stand out for me, we talked about before we started recording, are better taste and non-GMO. Non-GMO and organic are completely different things. And the GMO debate, probably not something to be having today, but there's a huge debate around genetically modified organisms. And the science is very, very clear from my understanding. And perhaps we'll get some comments from people arguing back. But my understanding is the science is very, very clear that GMOs are safe. Better taste is so subjective. An organic apple versus a non-organic apple, is one going to be better than the other? I think there's so many factors that go into making an apple or growing an apple, getting it from the farm to your hand. It's going to be incredibly difficult to kind of accurately measure those.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with any food, like, it's subjective alone, isn't it? So to say something because of it being organic would be different. I think it, like you say, it'd be impossible to tell because everyone's taste is so different. The rationale behind it, though, as is argued by food experts and chefs, is that it's the soil it's grown in. But again, it comes back to that subjectivity, that you really couldn't.
Yeah,
it's not a fact.
It's definitely not a fact,
So.
and those facts could go in either direction. And I think the biggest argument is, like you say, is the soil, and also the fact that it isn't or is sprayed with various things depending on what type of product you're buying. But I mean, we were talking before, weren't we? If you're not using sort of synthetic fertilizers, you're using manure, and that's being sprayed on your food instead. So, you know, swings and roundabouts.
Yeah, I think the obvious kind of one that I think we, or at least I've always thought with organic, and the obvious benefit is the reduced exposure to pesticides. There's no kind of and ahhing about that. It is just the case, isn't it? Because they're not used on it.
Yeah, I mean, if they're not used, you can't be exposed to them.
No, exactly.
There's probably another debate about how harmful some of those chemicals are, because some definitely will be, because some chemicals are banned, and they're banned because they are proven to be unhealthy or dangerous. There are some that it's a little bit of a question mark about whether they're harmful or not, and more research is needed. And then there are some that are just demonstrated to be safe. Couldn't list them all off the top of my head, but this is where it starts to become really, really complicated. So you are absolutely correct in what you say, in that you're going to have reduced exposure to those chemicals. But on the other hand, the question is, does that matter? It might matter to you on a personal level. It might make you feel better. But the evidence isn't as clear as to whether, on a scientific level, it makes any difference.
I guess on the other side of the coin, the benefit to it, if we look outside of us being affected by it, but the people who are using the chemicals on the farms, particularly in other countries where it's maybe a case of you've got a person walking around with like a backpack with the the pesticide in it. I think there's that element that actually it, in some instances, again, it depends what you're using, but in some instances it's obviously detrimental to their health. So organic farming can have the benefit that the farmers themselves, even if we exclude us consumers from the equation, it has that kind of that effect on them.
Yeah, that's definitely another factor. So I think it's definitely, in that respect, it's probably quite a big difference. There are obviously things you can do to protect somebody from chemical exposure, such as sort of respiratory protective equipment, and making sure that someone's wearing the right PPE as well. But in some countries, the rules are not as stringent, or they're not as enforced. And as well, it's incredibly difficult if you're in the middle of a field in a baking sun. You don't want to be wearing all of that stuff.
No, exactly. And I guess that crosses over not just to most people would think food, but you've got like there's a lot of other things that are grown organic, like clothing, for example.
Yeah.
Where again, you've got people floating about fields and spraying the stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, lower carbon emissions, that one's a very difficult one to nail down. But water conservation, certainly from our experience in clothing, organic does have benefits in that regard.
Yeah, same for improved soil health and biodiversity.
Yeah, so it's complicated is the answer. There are definitely benefits. Some of those benefits are quite clear. Some of them are subjective. Some of them are less strong, shall we say. So I think perhaps one of the most important things we need to kind of nail down here is, what is organic? What counts as organic? We've talked about the definition of organic from a purely dictionary point of view. Now, we talked about these slightly more complicated principles. But who decides? Can I just go and pick something out of the ground and call it organic?
If you've grown it yourself, mate, you can you can call it what you like, as long as you don't stick a label on it. That's
Okay.
the main thing.
So I can,
Or sell it.
so it's all right if I eat it, but not if I sell it. I need permission to sell it with the name organic.
In the UK, in Europe, yes. Rest of the world, I think it depends where you are.
Yeah, a little bit more complicated. In the
Exactly.
US, there is the USDA organic standards. But again, they are complicated. So I was doing some reading about this, and for something to be able to bear the USDA organic label in stores in the United States, it must meet the rules set out by the US Department of Agriculture. But the US Department of Agriculture has a list of substances that are permitted. Now, I'm not a farmer, so I can't tell you whether these are like really like standard, like sort of natural farming substances, whether they're not. But things like ethanol and isopropanol, so alcohols, are permitted. Some chlorines, hydrogen peroxide, copper sulfate, ozone gas. I think it's peracetic acid, soap, insecticides like boric acid and ammonium carbonate and ethylene gas. The list is really long. If you Google it, you can find the list. Now, I don't know whether that's good or bad. I'm not qualified to be able to say. A lot of those things kind of occur naturally anyway. So depending on what your definition of sort of natural and synthetic, they probably do still count as natural, but they sound scary when you just read a list of them.
I think that's like a lot of things, isn't it? Like when you start to look at the chemical names of things, it starts to sound scary, but actually in a lot of instances it doesn't necessarily have to be. Or it might just be totally okay.
Yeah.
Which I remember seeing it, like, again, this is pure like, off the cuff, but I remember seeing it was like a quote or something, someone saying that if you can't pronounce the like ingredients in something, then you
Yeah,
shouldn't
I've
eat it.
seen
And you're
this.
like, arguably the chemical names for some things are quite hard to pronounce. That does not inherently mean they're bad.
Yeah, there's that classic internet debate where I see people post stuff like that all the time, and then someone chimes in a comment underneath, and it's like, would you eat this and this and this? And then they just leave it there, and then the person who originally posted is like, hell no, I wouldn't eat that. And then they're like, and then the second person responds, well, I just listed the ingredients of an apple. And then that's supposed to like be the big sort of mic drop moment that changes the first person's mind, and they all go on and live happily ever after. But the reality is, it's not really going to change anything, is it? But yes, I think the point that you shouldn't eat anything if you can't pronounce it
somewhat
is somewhat flawed at the very least.
I mean, if it's like a bag of Skittles, you know that's not natural. You know it's probably not good. You're probably okay to eat it. You're not going to die immediately. But if you're eating all day every day, it's probably.
It tastes like the rainbow, apparently.
It does, yeah.
It's a bag of rainbow. Yeah, I think perhaps arguably the intent behind it is probably not terrible, but if you take it just purely from the way it's written, the words that they've used, it's completely wrong. But basically, here, at least in Europe, where we know a little bit more about it, to be able to call something organic and to have an organic label, it needs to be certified, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that certification varies somewhat. You can have things like like OCS blended, which is a certification, and that means the product has to contain at least 5%,
which is not very much
of organic material. It's not very much. No, you're right. So it might be that it contains other things. So it's important to check if something's blended or if it's 100%. But for the most part, the certifications are decent. They're in place. Like another kind of organic certification would be GOTS, and in that instance, I believe it's like 95% of it has to be organic, so a much higher proportion. And I think it does somewhat need to have that little bit of tolerance, because you think, like, let's say a t-shirt, maybe the thread in the let's say the neck, or like round the cuffs of the arm, which needs to be a bit more stretchy, it might be that that's like elastane or something, at which point it's not going to be 100% organic because of that. Or even like a polo shirt with buttons that aren't necessarily made of organic material, you're going to have that, you're going to need that room for movement, even though it's not quite 100%. And I think that's it needs to have that movement, really, to enable it to work.
Yes, it does. It does. I think the reality is, if you're selling something that's 100% organic, you're going to tell me about it. So if you see something that says 100% organic, like, or for the stuff that we often come across, it says like 100% organic cotton, and then that leaves the room for that like 1% of other stuff that's there to hold it together. So if like that way, because if I've got a product that is entirely organic, I'm going to make sure you know about it, rather than just say, oh, it's just organic, and then turns out that it meets the threshold for, say, 5% in some cases.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. Like, this is a little bit of a like caveat here, but I noticed the other day, think it was lemonade, it says 0 calories, but it actually had 5 calories in it. But you know, it's more like saying 5 calories is so much less like appealing than 0. So I think when it's those marginal differences,
there is. I mean, it's a slightly different topic, but there are rules that allow you to say that it's like calorie free if it's below a certain amount. Because let's be honest, 5 calories is so few that it's practically 0.
Yeah.
Certainly not able to sustain life just drinking your lemonade.
No, can you imagine all the quantity you have to get through?
You're gonna need to drink a lot of lemonade to get enough calories from 5 from like 1 serving. But yeah, I think it only counts. So let's summarize this a little bit here, because it's again, it's quite confusing. It only counts as organic if it meets the requirements in your jurisdiction as organic, and in Europe that means it needs to be certified by a certain organization. There are several of them, Soil Association and GOTS being the two that we see most often, and they have their own rules for giving that certification.
Exactly. The next kind of question, which I think causes a lot of confusion, is, are fair trade and organic the same?
No.
As exactly.
No, next.
Yeah. Well, I can see why you'd come to that conclusion. As we saw kind of earlier on, there are those crossovers, aren't there, which blur the lines a little bit. But fair trade, as we discussed in episode 1, is associated with the ethical practices and people being paid fairly for their products, among other things. Whereas organic, as we've just kind of discussed, is more about not using artificial chemicals. So they're very different things.
Yeah.
Products can carry both labels, so they could be both, but they're not the same certification. And that again goes into, if something's organic, is it also ethical inherently? And again, the answer's not necessarily, because ethics is about the working conditions, more so than the environment. Yes,
it's most likely there will be a lot of crossover in certainly in that regard, because generally the people that are making something organic will have values that align with the principles of sort of good labor practices and stuff like that.
Indeed, yeah. But I guess it's that differentiation is
Yeah.
it's not kind of one and the same.
It's not a certification. Well, we
Yeah.
say that, but then Soil Association, as we talked about before, has its 4 principles, which cover what we would describe as ethics.
Yeah, true.
So the answer is no, but also yes.
Yeah, it depends. A classic, isn't it? It depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah, I think as a good rule of thumb, you should probably assume just the word organic doesn't mean that it's sort of ethical in the supply chain sense, like looking after the people working within it. But it probably does, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah. And a lot of products, I think, they have other certifications, but they may not necessarily shout about them as greatly as organic is so well known. If you're going to shout about something, I mean, for example, let's say I had something that had SA 8000 certification for the ethics, which is from Social Accountability International. Not many people have heard of SA 8000. It doesn't really sound that sexy. Organic people have heard of. They know what it is. Like people are more likely to find that appealing, I think, than 2 letters followed by some numbers.
Yes, absolutely. So that brings us on to so we talked about what it is, what it can go alongside. But one of the biggest arguments that requires science to back it up is whether organic products provide an environmental benefit. And in summary here, the answer is basically a giant asterisk. So there is a few different elements to it. So there's greenhouse gases, there's soil erosion, there's biodiversity, there's water conservation. There's a lot of different elements to environmental sustainability. It's not just one thing. And the problem that I've been having whilst researching this episode is that no one can agree. No one can agree on whether all of these things are benefited by organic or not. So there is what's called the Farming Systems Trial, was a 40-year-long study conducted by the Rodale Institute, and it began in 1981, and they were looking at organic farming. And in their research, they found in their summary, organic practices increase soil organic matter, microbial biomass, diversity, and activity while reducing soil compaction. 30% higher yields during times of extreme weather. Organic yields match conventional yields for cash crops such as corn and soybean. Organic management increases water infiltration and does not contribute to the accumulation of toxins in waterways. I think that one's probably one of the easiest to kind of say, yeah, clearly. Even without premiums paid for organic crops, the organic manure system is the most profitable system, according to them. And finally, the organic system operational cost is significantly lower than conventional management. Sounds great. Happy days. Problem is, if I then go and look at, say, Cranfield University here in the UK, they say that yes, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by organic farming. However, they argue that organic farming has reduced yields. But you think, hang on, I just said that the Rodale Institute said 30% higher yields, but it says 30% higher yields during times of extreme weather. Now, that says to me that yields aren't 30% higher during normal times. So if Cranfield University are saying that it would normally reduce crop yields, it says by 40%, greenhouse gas emissions are actually not lowered overall, while they may be lowered on a per crop basis. They're not lowered overall because you will need more land to produce the same amount of food. Now, I think both these studies look specifically at food.
That's really interesting. Why the crops are higher during extreme weather? Is it that they're not getting blown out because the soil's healthier? Or I'd be intrigued to know what the cause is.
Yeah, I think that's probably a strong hypothesis you've just arrived at.
No, that'd be interesting to look into further as to what the causation was there and how they measured that as well.
So it's becoming a little bit of a theme in our podcast, Alex. But to conclude, I think what we've kind of discovered whilst talking about this is that the world of organic is not as clear cut as it's good or bad. It's good in some respects, it's not good in others. And I think the biggest problem with organic is the fact that it's so confusing because it's been adopted by so many different people to mean so many different things.
Yeah.
And then there's become so much sort of, I don't want to use the word misinformation because it's not necessarily deliberate, but it's just because it's been connected to so many things. There's just so many different opinions and different viewpoints about what it is.
It's misunderstanding rather than miscommunication, isn't it?
More so. Yeah. Is it going to save the world on its own? Well, no, obviously not. And I mean, that's maybe we need to rename our podcast to be the Things Are Not Black and White podcast or something like that. Because it is very sort of shades of grey. There are good elements to it. There are things that are, it's just not as good as it claims. I think it possibly depends as well on the type of crop, because I think our background, I think in cotton, it makes a very big difference. Whereas for food, some of the claims about it being tastier or better for you, they are less concrete.
Yeah.
Certainly taste is very subjective for a start.
Exactly. And like we were saying before, there's that difference between a crop in some respects being better for the environment, but in others it's not necessarily because of the way it's done. So there's always two sides to that coin, isn't there? There's no silver bullet, like you've kind of said. I think interestingly, something we haven't covered that I was just kind of thinking off the back of that, there's also like organic in transition, which adds another element to the kind of the confusion, because organic in transition is a good thing ultimately for farmers and everyone involved, or at least you perceive it to be a good thing, but it creates a marketing confusion because if it's in transition, it's not quite organic, but it's not
full organic, is it?
No, and you get companies naming it all sorts of different things to give it a name and to try and make it like a kind of branded word, but it's something people don't kind of understand, and it's not as clean cut. So I think that there is that kind of pitfall that while you're transitioning, it's kind of a little bit tricky because you have the expenses of organic, but without the benefit of the term to help you sell it, which I think is an interesting problem, and probably opening another can of worms here. But I think again, it comes back to this: it's not as clean cut as it sometimes appears.
In my understanding of organic in transition, it's a crop that the farmer or farmers are working towards becoming fully organic, but they're not yet there. So I guess everyone needs to be in that period at some point, but because there's a cost involved in switching, I guess that's where the organic in transition sort of labels come from, because then that's where that gives them potentially the ability to charge slightly more, which they can then use to cover some of the costs of the continuing the transition.
Yeah, not sexy though, is it?
It just makes it even more. It makes a confusing subject even more confusing. So if we want to try and simplify it, how do we summarize it in perhaps one sentence? Is organic good or is it bad? I think it's good, but not perfect.
Go organic if you can. If you can't, it's probably not the end of the world if you can't on everything, but where you can, it's probably worth it, because a lot of people benefit in the supply chain and yourself potentially as well.
But only because the standards that are being sold as organic go beyond the absolute dictionary definition of organic. That's why there's so many benefits to it.
Exactly. So I think all in all, I guess concluding thought is yes, it is a good thing, ultimately.
With an asterisk.
With an asterisk. With an asterisk.
Well, yeah, before we tie ourselves up in even more knots, I think we should probably leave it there for this week.
Yes, agreed. Cool. Well, until next week then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Scope. If you liked what you heard, then be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Follow us on social media too by searching the Sustainability Scope.